Hey everybody, Chris with Overclockers Club. We've got more goodies from MSI. This is MSI's version of the RTX 4080 from Nvidia. This is the Suprim X. It almost looks like Supreme, but it's actually Supreme. And there's actually a Supreme by itself without the X. So if we look over here at the offerings, currently in the 4080 category from MSI, this is the model we have today, the RTX 4080 16 gigabyte Suprim X. But if we look over here, there's actually a Supreme, and then we have the RTX 4080 Gaming Trio, Gaming X Trio, Ventus 3X Overclock, and a Ventus 3X. So we have several different versions of the 4080 from MSI. And again, this is the Suprim X, 16 gigabytes of GDDR6X memory, so we're almost ready to get this out of the box. But before we get it out of the box, there's some cool stuff here to look at on the back. And the back of the box shows that we've got the Frozr 3S. We've got the latest in cooling technology here from MSI, Torx fan 5.0. So we've got some specially designed fans there to maximize airflow and of course keep the sound down. Core pipes, precision machined heat pipes ensure the maximum contact to the GPU base plate to of course extract as much heat as possible. Vapor chamber, the GPU and memory modules, so both of them are covered with a vapor chamber which rapidly transfers heat to the core pipes. That's good. MSI center, we'll look at that later. I'm going to zoom in on this a little more. So we also have dedicated ray tracing cores, dedicated tensor cores, Nvidia DLSS, game ready and Nvidia Studio drivers, Nvidia GeForce Experience, Nvidia Broadcast, Nvidia G-Sync, Nvidia GPU Boost, PCI Express Gen 4, so this is a Gen 4 card, Microsoft DirectX 12 Ultimate, Vulkan RT APIs, Vulkan 1.3, OpenGL 4.6, and HDCP 2.3. And then over here to the right, we've got DisplayPort 1.4a. Supports 4K at 120 Hz HDR, 8K at 60 Hz HDR, and variable refresh rate as specified in HDMI 2.1a. And looking down here, ultimate platform for gamers and creators. So let's see, there's nothing here. Nothing terribly exciting there. Let's see, specifications. So this is of course, the RTX 4080, 16 gigabytes of GDDR6X. Memory bus is 256-bit, and we have 3 display ports and 1 HDMI port. All right, by now you've probably seen what the card looks like. I mean, you can bring it up on the MSI website right now, and you can see it. Pretty much looks like what's in the box here, but let's go ahead and get it open. Sometimes the photos that are sort of leaked and what the final product looks like can be different. Okay, so here's a little card that sort of gives you an overview of what's going on here. So on the back, it has a lot of the key features. So some of the stuff we already talked about on the back of the box, but there's a lot of concentration on the fin design, the fin shape. Again, the goal here is to get as much heat out of the graphics card as possible, move as much air through it, and do it as efficiently and quietly as possible. So that's what they're basically talking about here. The dual BIOS gives you the choice to prioritize full performance in gaming mode or low noise in silent mode. Here it talks more about the fin design, the air antigrade design of the fins, metal backplate, thermal pads under the sturdy metal backplate provide additional cooling, so that's good. Anti-bending die casting. So there's a special plate that reinforces the card. So that's good. Effective thermal padding. Mystic Light, of course. MSI Center. HCI, high efficiency carbonyl inductors. Improvements to our inductor parts allow the design to operate with less choke noise and better electric filtering. So that's a nice improvement. Dr. Moss Power Stage Solutions. Provide great efficiency with low power loss and enhanced voltage controls. Okay, so let's go ahead and see what else is going on. Okay, this is nice. I know you're not here to look at a mouse pad, you want to see the card, but this pad certainly looks too nice to just glance over. So let's see. Oh yeah, that's a nice mouse pad. All right, what else? Here's your special 3-in, 1-out power connector. Please use 3 individual PCI cables from the power supply. Yeah, you want to make sure you use all 3. And a special bracket. Now this is used to support the back of the card. It's so heavy you don't really want to suspend the card only by the very front. Okay, let's see. Get this out of here. Boy, this is in there pretty good. There we go. All right. And there it is. And this thing is definitely larger than the 4090 Founders Edition up here. I thought this thing was huge, but looking at this card, I'm not so sure the 4090 is looking all that big. So I'll bring the 4090 down later and compare the two sort of side by side, but we can get all this protective plastic peeled off here. All right, so this is kind of boring, so I'll just go ahead and get all this peeled off and be back in just a moment. Whoops, I forgot there's actually a piece on the back. There we go. All right. So, this thing is amazing. So there are the 3 display ports and 1 HDMI port. They've got little plugs in there to sort of protect them while they're not being used. Pretty generous opening there to allow air through. This looks to be a some sort of lighting effect. We'll see that when we get it powered up. There's a single power connector. Actually, let me just go ahead and move the camera right over there to it. There you go, you can really see it along the back. And there are the terminations for all of the heat pipes. And there's a better look at the output end. Those are some pretty good sized heat pipes down in there. And of course the back. You can see there's some few little cutouts there again to improve airflow. Well, there are little plastic covers everywhere. I almost missed these here on the ends of the fan faces. A little tricky to get those off. Okay, there we go. So some of the questions I'll be trying to answer, when I look at this card, are how good is the cooling solution? How cool does it really keep the card? Of course, being a 4080, it's a notch below the 4090. So how much below, performance-wise, is the 4080 compared to the 4090? So I'll post the specs for the 4080 and 4090 so that you can see what the differences are on paper. And it's no secret that the 4090 packs a real wallop. There's some serious horsepower there. But when you compare the 4090 Suprim X to the 4080 Suprim X, you can see what the real differences are. And if you stare at these numbers for a little bit, other than the obvious differences in processing power, what I see, if you look down where the recommended PSU is, on the 4090 Suprim X, it recommends 1000 watts. That's what MSI recommends. The minimum is 850, that is per the Nvidia spec. And then if you look at the 4080, the power requirement, MSI recommends 850 watts, and the minimum being 750. Again, that should fall in line with the Nvidia recommendation, or specifications, I should say. The other thing is look at the weight between the cards, and I think this is the same with the Founders Edition. The 4090 is just a little bit heavier than the 4080. And I almost forgot to look at the underside of the cards, so let's take a quick look at that. So it's nothing but fin stack as far as you can see. Of course, this is the view of the card that you would not normally see when it's in the case and working in your system. I thought the 4090 was really big and heavy, but you know, picking this card up, this thing really is very large, very heavy, which brings me to the next concern of I think this bracket to support the back of the card, I think this is going to be a necessity and not so much an option. So we'll definitely get this set up in a case. I've got an MSI case, the Sakura 500. It's actually sitting off to the side here, but we'll get the system built up, and we'll use the, and it's a little hard to see, but this is actually the brand new from MSI, the Z790 carbon Wi-Fi. So we'll be getting that motherboard installed as a system build in the case. We'll also be using the power supply over here, again a little hard to see, but it is the MPG A1000G. And staying with the latest socket, the LGA 1700, this is the MAG Core Liquid C280 from MSI. This is the cooler that we'll be using on the test system. Now there are a couple of different types of cards. These are your, what I call OEM stock Founders Edition here from Nvidia. Reference cards, people call them. So we got a 4080 and a 4090. You can see they're pretty much identical. They use the exact same chassis and same exterior features. And then you have these from your various manufacturers. These are AIB or add-in board cards. Some people call them custom cards. And what they do is they take the guts, the hardware out of here, the processor, and then they use their own board and they customize the voltage regulation, their thermal solution, the RGB effects, things like that, and you end up with, again, a custom card. And really the sky's the limit in terms of what the manufacturers can do. Again, this MSI card here, you can see it's considerably larger than the Founders Edition here from Nvidia. This is a 4080, 4090. Again, these have the same chassis and the same frame. But you can see how much larger the 4080 version from MSI is. It's longer, it's slightly taller. This is a 2070 Super there for reference. You can see how small and thin it is compared to this 4080 Suprim X. And you really get a feel for how much difference there is in size when you get down here and look at these from the end view. There's a considerable difference. And the point being, you need to pay attention to the size of your card when you're building your system, because you need to make sure a card this size will fit in your case. Because this one is about 335 millimeters long, and you can understand why manufacturers put these reinforcements there on their PCIe slots. On a small card, you know, it's not that big of a deal, but a large, heavy card, this really makes sense. Now, something important here is when you're plugging your power cable in, you'll notice there's a little tab right there, a little catch, and that locks in. And you can feel it when it's engaged, but you can also hear it. So I'm going to move the microphone here right next to it so you can hear what's going on. Microphone right there. And when we push it in, you can hear that little click. And Let me get my microphone back here. Not only do you want to listen for the click, you can sort of feel the click when it engages, but you also need to make sure, get my cable out of the way, that it is fully seated. You can see there's no gap there between the plug and the socket down there at the bottom. Come around to the side here, and it's really important to ensure that it is fully engaged. And this card has zero Frozr functionality, and what that is, of course the system's off. Let me go ahead and just turn it on. So the fans come on when you first power the system up, but you'll see once the operating system loads, the fans will stop, and the zero Frozr is turned on. What that does is when there's no demand, there's no heat being generated, the fans basically stop because you don't need the fans. A lot of power supplies have that now too. Sometimes there's a switch that you can turn 0 RPM on or off, and basically the fan for the power supply doesn't do anything until there's enough heat generated. So let me log into my system here, and what I'll do is let me put a little stress on the GPU there. What I'll do is I'll fire up some AIDA64 testing, and it'll take it a moment to generate enough heat, but you'll see the fans kick on once it gets hot enough. And there you see the fans are on. The temperature was about 61 C when they came on, and it'll slowly start to bring the temperature down a little bit. So I canceled the test, so we should see the fans kick off here as soon as the temperature is brought down. Sometimes it takes it a few moments. And there they go. And that is, let's see, 40 degrees Celsius is where the fans turned off. And to access the zero Frozr mode, we come over here and we get into the MSI Center, if I can keep my camera straight. And all of these features here, these are all, they are available, but you have to install them first before you can use them. So the one we're looking for here is the graphics fan tool. And if you look at the three little bars here, you can uninstall it if you don't want it. But if you click on this, it brings up a YouTube video that shows you how to use it, and that's really nice. But we'll go ahead and open it. And you can see there are only two things to select here. You've got zero Frozr, it's turned on right now. Mouse over the question mark, and on is tranquility, or you can turn it off completely. So if I don't want the zero Frozr to come on, and the fans are just on based on temperature, then you turn the zero Frozr off. Let me click it on, and the fans should turn off. There we go, yeah. So the fans turn off when the zero Frozr is enabled. Now the cooler boost here, this is nice, and mouse over the question mark, it says the feature forces fans to spin at 100% speed for 30 seconds. The start button will be available again after 5 minutes. So I'll click that here in a moment. Bring it over to the fans. And this is if you need a real quick blast to cool things down. So I'll click the start, and they should spool up to 100%. And yeah, I can hear them. Of course, you're not normally going to have your graphics card sitting out in the open like this. It's going to be in a case, so it would be quieter. But for 3 fans spinning at 100%, it's not bad. And then after 30 seconds, they should spool down on their own. And there they go. And the start button here, like it said, you can see it's grayed out. It should be available after 5 minutes. But that's what that feature does. Now, as far as fan noise is concerned, the fans are almost at idle. They're barely running. And the decibel meter here is about 3 feet away. Now, keep in mind, you're not in a case, so ideally when your graphics card is mounted in a case, the case will do a great deal to keep the sound down. But out in the open, let's just see. So ambient is around 40 decibels, and when we go ahead and crank the fans all the way up 100%, which normally you wouldn't be running them at that, at least not all the time, but let's just see how loud it is. So it looks like we're right at about 60 decibels or just a tick under. So let me get the fans knocked back down. But like I said, normally your graphics card is probably not going to be running at 100%. And of course, when it's in a case, it will be very quiet. Okay, so just for the heck of it, I've got the 4080 Founders Edition in there. The fans are cranked down to just barely running. Ambient is about the same at 40 decibels, so let's go ahead and crank the fans up 100% and see how much difference there is. So it looks like we're about 3 decibels lower. We maxed out at almost 60 on the Suprim X, and on the Founders Edition we're running at about 57. So slight difference. One thing I wanted to point out earlier, and I forgot when I was plugging in the cable for the power. Now this single cable here comes from the power supply, and it comes with the power supply. But this is the cable connector that comes with the graphics card, and it's a 3-into-1. And ideally, you want to use 3 separate cables coming off of your power supply. Is really the best way to do it. And of course, the same thing applies when you plug this in. Be very careful to make sure it is plugged in all the way. There's no gap, and that you ensure that the little tab there is engaged and locked into position. All right, so next I'll fire up each one of these cards, the Founders Edition 4090, Founders Edition 4080, as well as the MSI 4080 Suprim X. And I'll run some synthetic benchmarks and some gaming benchmarks, and we'll look at the results and compare the scores and look at the temperatures and all that kind of fun stuff. So we'll be back with the results here in a little bit. So this shows up. This is the brand new RTX 4070 Ti. It will have its own separate review, but I'm going to go ahead and throw it into the benchmark mix anyway, just to compare the numbers. Time to fire up the thermal camera. All right, we'll do a little benchmarking here with 3D Mark Time Spy. We can take a look at the card. The fans just kicked on a moment ago. You can see the 3 fans here, and on the back, you can see exactly where the processor is. Bit of a hot spot there in the center, but that's normal. That's to be expected. Rest of the back plate seems to be fairly consistent temperature wise. And then we can look at the fins across the top. And let's see on the end, not much to see. You can see the termination points for the heat pipes. And a little bit of heat here coming out the other end where you plug in the HDMI and your DisplayPort cables. And since it's testing time, I guess I should put up the slide that shows the components of the test system. So we'll be using the MSI Z790 Carbon Wi-Fi DDR5 motherboard. The CPU is the Intel Core i9-13900K. The cooler is the MSI MAG Core Liquid C280. GPUs, of course, are the RTX 4090 and 4080 Founders Edition, and then the MSI RTX 4080 Suprim X. The memory is Mushkin 32 gigabytes of, I'm not going to read that number, in a 32 gigabyte kit. The PSU is an MSI MPG A1000G PCIe 5. The case that we'll end up using in the case build, the system build, will be the MSI Sakura 500P, and the operating system is Windows 11. And now I'll stress the graphics card to sort of show how much power it uses. Now this is from Nvidia, this is the PCAT, and what this does is this enables you to monitor the power going to your graphics card. So this shows you exactly what your graphics card is using. So the power comes from your power supply, runs up here to this module, goes through the module where it is monitored in real time. This little display shows you the voltage as well as the wattage. You can see right now we're at idle. And then the output comes up to the graphics card, and there's a little riser down there that is specific to this PCAT. And then there is software here, the Nvidia PCAT utility, which is used to collect the data. You can see right now we're at idle. We've got two things on the graph. The darker line, or the darker plot, is the voltage, and the lighter plot, let me zoom in there, the lighter plot is the wattage. You can see they parallel each other closely. So the first thing I'll do is I'll fire up Folding at Home, which stresses the graphics processor for protein folding. And I'll fire that up first, but you can see right now, again, the average is somewhere between 30 and 40, and the maximum 358 actually is from some testing I just did a minute ago. So let's clear the numbers out there. All right, so let me fire up the folding client. So I started the folding client here, and it takes it a moment, and you will see this do a little bump, I believe around 60 watts, and then it will shoot up shortly thereafter. And it takes a few seconds to really get in gear. There we go. So there's the first bump. Again, you can see the voltage and the wattage parallel each other. And then we should see a big spike. And there we go. And this is very sporadic in terms of the power usage. It's sort of up and down very rapidly. We can look over here and see there's our maximum. Earlier I saw around 358, so this will bump up a little higher as we hit some spikes. But you can see it is all over the map. And then we get the same as we look over here at the display. You get the real-time power used, but those numbers are moving so much it's a little hard to keep track. So now this gives you an idea of what folding looks like as far as power usage. And now I will run the MSI combustor. So here you can see I shut down the folding client and we drop down to an idle state again. Looks like the maximum is 354 watts, but again, that's a very brief spike. And the MSI combustor puts a more consistent load. So let's go ahead and run this. We'll just run it for a couple of minutes, and then I'll come back and we'll look at what PCAT is showing. All right, so I shut the combustor down, and you can see it's much more consistent. And we're averaging right around 300 watts. Again, the peak was still at 354. And again, the voltage parallels the wattage there. And of course, the scale for the voltage is, since it's 12 volts, it's not 300, of course. Okay, so looking at the cooling solution here, what I want to do is stress the system using the MSI combustor. And then we'll watch the temperature. And what we should see is the temperature slowly rise, and then the fans will kick on, and then we should see the temperature stabilize. So the goal here is to keep the card as cool as possible and also keep it as quiet as possible. So right now we're idling at about roughly 38 degrees Celsius. You can see here we're using between 30 and 40 watts at idle. I'll go ahead and get the stress test running. And then I'll monitor the temperature here, and then we'll look and see at what temperature the fans come on. Usually takes a couple of minutes to warm up. And then I'll look to see where the temperature stabilizes once the fans are running. Okay, so the temperature just hit 62 and the fans just kicked on. So now I'll watch the temperature and see with the fans running, and they're not running very fast. It's very quiet. I can stand right next to it and you can't hear a thing. So now I'll just watch the temperature and see what it does. All right, everything seems to be stable. We're holding at about 63, 64 degrees Celsius. The fans on the graphics card are running at about 1,000 RPMs. And our temperature, again, we're at, let's see, yeah, 64 Celsius. And let's see what else. Our power usage right now, we are at 311 watts. We're holding right around that number. Okay, so now I will go ahead and put the RTX 4080 Founders Edition card in there and run the same sort of testing here and see what the numbers look like. And now the 4080 Founders Edition is installed. Looks like we're using a little bit lower power here at idle. And the temperature, we are at, let's see, 27.1 degrees C. So let's go ahead and put the stress on it and see what that does. So right away you can see the temperature jumps up to 47. Fans are not on yet. Oh, they just came on and we are at 50. So we'll let this run a little while and see where the temperature ends up. All right, so we've been running a little while here. We hit a max of 60.1 C, so we're holding real close to 60 degrees Celsius. The fans are running a little over 1200 RPMs and we're pulling just over 300 watts. Let's look at the specifications again real quick just to compare. So let me highlight the columns here that we're talking about. So we're looking at the two 4080s here. We're looking at the Founders Edition. We're looking at the MSI RTX 4080 Suprim X. And you can see pretty much everything's the same. We've got the same memory, the same processor. Our memory clock speed's the same. There is a slight difference on the boost clock. You can see here we're at 2625 megahertz compared to 2505. So we have a slight advantage here on the Suprim X. Core clock is the same. ROP is the same, core is the same, and we have of course, a difference in the price. All right, and here's my list of benchmarks. Now the top half here, these are the synthetic benchmarks, and the bottom half, these are the gaming benchmarks. The monitor I'm using is from Viotech. It's a 3440 by 1440 on the resolution, 144 hertz. And when I do my testing, I crank the settings all the way up, whether that's insane or ultra or super ultra, whatever it is. I crank them all the way up, and then I run all of the games and all of the benchmarks at the same settings unless something is not supported, which I've got one instance of that in here, and I'll talk about that later. So the cards I used in my testing, I've got an RTX 3070 Ti, a 4070 Ti, RTX 4080, this is a Founders Edition. The 3070 Ti is also a Founders Edition. The MSI RTX 4080, which is the Suprim X, and then we have a Founders Edition RTX 4090. And as you scan across here, the results are really fairly predictable. No surprises that the 4090, of course, kicks everyone else's butt. That's to be expected. But if we just look at the two 4080s here, the Founders Edition and the MSI, let me highlight those to make it a little easier. When we compare the numbers here, they're really pretty close between Blender, the benchmarks in Blender and 3D Mark and VR Mark. You can see that we're very, very close. In fact, I could run these tests back to back and we would get very similar numbers. So nothing really jumps out a whole lot. You can see that your 4080 would get you maybe a few more frames per second with the slightly higher boost clock, but overall your performance here between these two is going to be virtually the same. I don't think you could tell which card was in your system if you were running them blindly. And we see similar performance here between the different games. So I ran Borderlands 3, F1 22, Cyberpunk 2077, and the numbers are within a couple ticks of each other. So no real difference there in performance. And when we compare things to the 4070 Ti, of course the performance on the 4080 side is better, considerably better. Frames per second here when it comes down to gaming, it is better. The 4080 is better in some cases by a larger margin on the F1 22. Cyberpunk 2077 with DLSS on, you can see you get a nice boost on the frames per second. DLSS off, which I don't know why you would ever run it that way, but the improvement is still a little higher. What is interesting here, actually, if you look at the 3070 Ti, and I'm not sure why, because I ran this test several times because I thought the numbers would change or I'd done something wrong, but here in the VR mark, the 3070 Ti actually performed better than the 4070 Ti, more in line with the 4080s, and I'm not sure why they're all the same across there except on the 4070. And like I said, I ran this one several times and this one several times between these two, and I got pretty much the same numbers. And all these numbers, of course, you know, this makes sense, except when you get to here, I really would have expected this to be in the 14 to 15 range, and for whatever reason, it's not. And up here on the synthetic benchmarks, the 3070 Ti did not support DLSS 3, so I ran it under DLSS 2. So that number there doesn't really mean a whole lot when you compare it to the others, because you can't really compare it since it doesn't support that. When we look at the other benchmarks, though, everything else really scales as you would expect, going from the 30 series into the 40 series and all the way up to the top of the line, RTX 4090. And looking at the cost, you know, there's a lot of discussion on the price points here for these cards. And, you know, these are really expensive, and that's a lot of money, but it's really always been that way. Anytime there's a new release, there's always a struggle between, do I want the latest and greatest? Do I want to pay the entry fee to join that club? Or do I hold out? Do I wait to see if maybe AMD drops something and Nvidia has to shuffle the pricing around? It's really hard to say. I covered all the specs on my hardware earlier when I was testing, but we'll go ahead and cover them again. Okay, time for the system build. The case I'm using here is from MSI. This is the Secure 500p. If you're interested, you can check out the review. I'll post the link for it in the description. Test system consists of the MSI Z790 Carbon Wi-Fi motherboard with a 13900K CPU. Of course, the graphics card is the 4080 Suprim X, also from MSI. One thing I want to point out here, you got to be careful with your power cable. Now this case, there is enough room. You can close the door, and I'm not putting stress on the cable. I'm not bending it, but that's definitely a consideration. You do not want to bend this and stress your socket any more than you absolutely have to. So be careful there when you put a card this large in a case. Make sure it does fit comfortably. Now here's the support that we looked at the very beginning, and what this does, and it's very necessary, to keep the end of the card from sagging, because if I take this off, this end of the card here will want to droop down a little bit, and you really need this to support the card. So you just push up just a little bit to level the card out, sort of take the load off of the socket so you're not twisting or bending it. And then you snug it down here, you tighten this, and this will support the end of the card. The other thing is, once you have your system built with a card this large, when it's mounted to your motherboard, be very careful moving the case around. Don't drop it, because the impact when the case hits the ground can cause your card to put an excess amount of strain on your socket back there on the motherboard. So again, be very careful when you're moving your case around when your system is completely built. And I know I pointed this out earlier, but I'll mention it again since you can't really see the power supply back there very well. But this is the MPG A1000G PCIe 5 power supply. Of course, it is 1000 watts, so that is the power supply that we're using here in the test system today. I almost forgot to mention the cooler I'm using is the MAG Core Liquid C280. Something to keep in mind when you use a card this large, and I don't just mean this large physically, but in terms of the heat that it's going to be dumping into your case, you need to make sure you have good ventilation, that you have good fans either in the top or the front or the back, wherever, to keep the heat from building up in your case. Now the card does have the rear exhaust, but that only helps so much. The bulk of the heat will be dumped into your case, so just keep that in mind when you're building a new system, or if you're putting your card into an existing system. Just make sure you've got good airflow. So really the last thing to cover here are the RGB effects, which you can see on the side of the card. Of course, when the card is mounted in this position, the RGB effects on the fans you can't really see, other than the reflections on the bottom of your case. But they did add this little area here that sort of highlights the RGB effects, so that you can see them from this side of the card, which is usually not the prettiest side of the card. Okay, so your motherboard manufacturers, they all supply software packages that allow you to get in and control your RGB effects. So MSI here, they use software called the MSI Center, and you can get in and look at your RGB effects here. So we come over here to features and we want Mystic Light. And you can see there's a representation of the graphics card. So when you change the effects over here, you can see what it will look like. So you can kind of get a preview. So if we do a color cycle, you can see what happens. You can select different colors. You can change the speed and the brightness. You have a lot of different effects here that are available. Up here, you can select a different profile. You can create a profile and then save it. Here is where you link all of the components, the RGB components together so that they all synchronize together, or you can control them all independently if you want to unlink them. It's up to you. But that's how the RGB effects work. Now earlier I was doing my temperature testing with the motherboard and the card out here on my test bench. So you're pulling in relatively cool ambient air. And the reality is your card is going to be inside of a case. So you're going to be at the mercy of whatever heat is being dumped in by the rest of your components, your fan placement, fan speed, all that kind of stuff. So this is more of a realistic test. I've got F122 running. The fans just kicked on a little bit ago when we hit the 60-degree temperature threshold. And you can see they are running, and we're holding at about 61°C inside the case. So this should give you an idea, you know, what to expect when gaming. And again, it depends on the case you're using and your fan placement. A lot of other factors will affect your temperature of your graphics card. All right, so I've been looping the benchmark here on the F122 for several minutes. Case is definitely warm. You can feel the warm air coming out the top here and through the rear exhaust. But as far as the graphics card is concerned, it is holding at 61°C. Fan speed hasn't really changed any. I've got the graphics cranked up to the maximum settings. So that just tells me that even though I'm inside of a case, at least in this particular situation, the card is certainly not overheating at all. Now I could go in and turn the zero Frozr off, crank the fan speed up a little bit, and bring those temperatures down even more if I wanted to. But right now, the noise from the game is certainly drowning out any fan noise from the case. Okay, so I did just that. I went in and manually cranked the fan speed up, and you can see we've pulled 10 degrees off of the GPU temperature. And when I stand over here, I know it's a little hard to hear, but I can hear a little more fan noise, but it's certainly nothing to be concerned about. So right now, the 4080 is $1,399, call it $1,400 on Amazon. Now there's one thing that's a little interesting. If you look down here in the About This item, it says chipset GeForce RTX 4090. I'm pretty sure that's a misprint. Overall, I really like this card. It's a nice looking card. The additional cost over a standard 4080, you get your RGB effects if you like that. You get the triple fans that do a great job at keeping the card cool and not sounding like a jet engine. The price point, of course, you know, you're not getting 4090 performance. You're getting very close to it, but of course you're not paying the 4090 price either. So I would give this the Overclockers Club Gold Award. This is Chris with Overclockers Club. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.